Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies. So today we're taking a look at a documentary called The Death of Superman Lives. What happened? And indeed, what the heck happened to this movie? Well, after watching it, I sort of have a mixed reaction to it because I'm not really sure if they should have gone with the direction that they were going in retelling the Superman legend and basing it on the comic books, specifically The Death of Superman and so on and so forth. So let's just deal with a couple of things here. First of all, I had first heard about this project back in 1998. It was, or 97 or 98, and I'd heard that Nicolas Cage was going to be cast and Tim Burton was directing, and at that time they also suggested it was really one of the first times that I can recall, the possibility of a Batman vs. Superman movie, which we of course got much later on. So what exactly happened here? I think the film itself avoids the central problem, which was the fact that John Peters was involved. So let's backtrack. John Peters. Now, this is a former hairdresser who later became a big-time executive producer and boyfriend to Barbra Streisand. But more importantly, let's take a look at some of the things he was involved with. Producer for Stars Born with Barbra Streisand back in 1976, The Main Event, that also starred Barbra Streisand. Okay, not the greatest movies. He also did Eyes of Laura Mars, but then there were some that were decent. Caddyshack, Flashdance, DC Cab, and later on The Color Purple, executive producer, so that's not a bad resume necessarily, as well as producer on Witches of Eastwick, Inner Space, of course Caddyshack 2. Anyway, he was also producer, more importantly, considering what we're talking about here, Batman, Tim Burton's Batman back in 1989. Then also he served as an executive producer for Man of Steel, and he was involved in Superman Returns back in 2006, which is one of the very worst, most tedious anyway, I should say one of the most tedious Superman flicks ever made was Superman Returns, with Brandon Routh. And The Wild Wild West, which I've never had the pleasure of watching, at least not yet. And now he's currently involved in yet another remake of A Star is Born. How interesting is that? I don't know. Okay, so what happened with Superman Lives? Because this was a production, multi-million-dollar production. Nicolas Cage was, of course, going to play Superman. They were taking some ideas that seemed interesting. They devoted a lot of time to this in the documentary about the fact that the suit itself was going to have all these, it wasn't spandex initially. In other words, it was almost like, because he was being regenerated as if he was in a tomb or something of this nature, it had a lot of, you could see through it. It was almost like an electrical suit. And that was sort of interesting. And then you see how it starts to evolve, particularly during these photo shoots and video shoots of Nicolas Cage dressed as Superman. And you see that slowly but surely they get the cape, and there's the S, and has a very muscle-bound with the abs type suit, which of course we saw in the Batman and Robin and Batman Forever type movies. So that was almost that was a big thing at one time. Anyway, I guess technically it still is, but so you see that, and he has the long hair, which is what the Superman comics had, particularly after the death of Superman. And then dressed as Clark Kent, and well, maybe he could just have a Mickey Mouse shirt with a. You sort of look like one of these nerds, you know, that works in computers. But they were still developing it. And then he had Nicolas Cage has the short hair, and then you see the full Superman suit as it would look. They were going to bring back Lois Lane, of course. One of the suggestions was Sandra Bullock as Lois Lane, so I thought that was not a bad choice. Christopher Walken as Brainiac, that was going to be our villain. And Kevin Spacey, of course, did play Lex Luthor, and in Superman Returns was the choice to play Lex Luthor in this film. Now, one of the interesting thing I thought that was rather clever, and seems like it might have been sort of incorporated in Man of Steel, was the way that Krypton looked. So they weren't going for what essentially looked like an ice planet in the original films by Richard Donner and Richard Lester. Now, Jon Peters, and this was addressed by Kevin Smith before, so if any of you have ever seen An Evening with Kevin Smith, you know this story about Jon Peters, because Kevin Smith was the original screenwriter that at least got paid, even though his script was never used for Superman Lives, initially called Superman Reborn. Anyway, the story he told was that when he met with Jon Peters, Jon Peters had some ideas. First of all, Superman wouldn't fly, Superman wouldn't wear the suit, and there had to be a giant spider. Not to mention the fact that there would be polar bear guards at the Fortress of Solitude, which of course begs the question, what does Superman need guards for, let alone polar bears? So all of these things were kind of factored into it. But I'd heard this stuff again, before from Kevin Smith, but what was interesting is that Jon Peters denies the fact that the character wouldn't have the suit and that he wouldn't fly. But it goes to show Jon Peters, what did he really know about Superman? Well, that's the most basic thing. I mean, Superman has to fly, and he's got to have a suit. And it should be the suit that more or less is familiar to everybody. Then there was a discussion about having that red underwear, and so on. So you see a lot of this at work, but because this was only like a 3-week pre-production deal, and didn't go anywhere, and it was the rug was pulled from under them, based on the fact that there were some films that were out that didn't do well, namely Batman and Robin especially, which was not, I guess it didn't tank nearly as bad as people might have expected. It still made over $100 million, but it was significantly less than what the other Batman films cost, and I guess it didn't recoup, technically, the budget, its original budget. So superhero movies were sort of, kind of, it was plummeting. It was just not going to happen. They weren't doing well. And you had films like Steel that's brought up, and so it just didn't look like this was going to manifest itself. But then, it took many years until we saw Spider-Man in 2002 by Sam Raimi that rejuvenated the genre in a major way. Now, the documentary is directed by somebody who's involved in animation. His name is John Schnepp. And he's worked as an animation director on various shows, including The Venture Brothers and Metalocalypse. Wow, that's a tough one to say. And he does a pretty good job of interviewing Tim Burton in this film, who is interviewed, and others. Not Nicolas Cage. Doesn't look like he's interviewed. Wesley Strick is another screenwriter who you might know, wrote Cape Fear and several other films too. The remake of Cape Fear, that is. And but overall, I felt as if, and I think this was part of the problem with Lost in La Mancha, which is also about a film that never came to really fruition. I mean, there was a budget and they got further along with it than this Superman Lives. But you feel as if there was still more that could have been said. Or maybe it should have been shorter. It just feels as if it's not quite enough to captivate most people's interest. I mean, if you're interested in Superman, you'll learn a lot about it, but it was really just half as entertaining to hear Kevin Smith talking than anyone else in this documentary. They seem like they're very detached from it, as if they don't really want to discuss it, but they are there to discuss it. So not a bad film, interesting, but worth seeing just once, I think. So do check it out, because it is sort of an interesting footnote in the Superman franchise. I mean, I think there were aborted projects of Superman long before there was even pre-production to star Christopher Reeve after Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. So but this is like one that you heard about and you wonder what might have been, and there are pictures out there of Nicolas Cage dressed as Superman. So he would have been a good fit for it, I think. But as they've established in the film, in this documentary, maybe an unknown would have been best. And so they went that route with Brandon Routh, and that didn't go too well. But then, well, Man of Steel, I think, worked pretty well. With Henry Cavill. So there you have it. And those are my thoughts on it, and this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.